My pleasure to welcome you to our session today on Russia, Ukraine, and U.S. security, and to welcome Ambassador William Taylor for our session today. The topic needs no introduction. If you read the morning newspaper, you're up to speed on the topic. We're at an historic moment with a great deal of uncertainty in front of us, a great deal of international and domestic political debate, and a welter of conflicting data about the nature and dynamics of the unfolding confrontation. I'm very grateful to recognize one of our nation's great authorities on this topic today, Ambassador William Taylor, who is Vice President at the United States Institute of Peace for Russia and Europe. Bill has served previously as U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine in the period from 2006 to 2009, and also as chargé d'affaires in the embassy in Kyiv. He's had quite a few very important diplomatic assignments in his career. He served in Baghdad as the first director of the Iraq Reconstruction Management Office. He served in Kabul as coordinator of international and U.S. assistance to Afghanistan. He was in the center of the Arab-Israeli peace process for a little while, so one of America's most trusted diplomats and a man willing to put on a tie for a talk to Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. Bill is a graduate of West Point and of Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government, and he served as an infantry platoon leader and combat company commander in the U.S. Army in both Vietnam and Germany. Bill, thanks so much for joining us today. Thanks for putting on a tie for the occasion. We'll count on you to make some opening remarks of 30 to 45 minutes. Then we'll open it up for discussion. We have a very large turnout today, 260 people at the moment. And I encourage those attendees to be prepared to jump into the conversation when the moment arrives. Please raise your hands electronically to join the conversation. Please don't wait to the last minute to do so. But if you prefer, go ahead and send items in the chat function, and I will read them out and try to get everything in the time available to us today. Bill, thanks so much for making the time to do this. Thank you for your leadership on these issues. Over to you.
Now you can hear me.
We're good.
Very good, very good. Well, Brad, thank you, first of all, very much for this great opportunity. This is a wonderful chance to talk to people who are very well informed and working on these kinds of issues every day. And as you say, the newspapers are full of it. Full of this story, sorry. And I'm very pleased to be able to talk about this for some period of time, probably not the full 30 minutes that you've allotted me, because I look forward to the questions and the comments. I mean, I hope, Brad, that I will say something that is controversial. I hope that I will say something that half the people on this call disagree with, and they want to take me to task for it. I'm wide open for that. I anticipate that. I'll be disappointed if we don't get some kind of disagreement on some of these things. As you say, there's a lot of discussion. There are a lot of views about what should be done. There are a lot of views about what might happen. So do exactly. Let me just encourage everybody to do exactly what Brad Roberts just said. That is, stick your hand up and ask questions and call me out when I've made a mistake. We are facing. This is a tough time. This is a tense time. We're facing the possibility of a major land war in Europe, the largest since World War II. We've got two formidable military forces facing each other in Russia and Ukraine. Needless to say, to this audience, the Russian military can overwhelm the Ukrainian military. There's no doubt about that. But the Ukrainian military has been fighting the Russians for the past 8 years, and they're prepared. We're going to talk about this. We're going to talk about the Ukrainian preparations and what they can expect. But this will be if it happens, this will be a major war, a major event that we will all have to deal with. I get questions all the time, and in the newspapers that Brad referred to, you get people opining on the question: Is President Putin going to invade Ukraine? And only one man knows. Only President Putin knows, and everybody else can guess or speculate. And I get asked this a lot. I used to say about 2 weeks ago, as of about 2 weeks ago, I said it was 55-45 against an invasion. I have adjusted that. I'm now 50-50, and I caveat this by saying that, again, no one knows what's in Putin's head. And it's a fool's errand to try to figure out what's in his head. And it could go either way. But think about it, a 50% chance of a major land war in Europe today, with the kind of casualties that will inevitably bring, is horrible. Is hard to think about. 50% chance of a major land war in Europe. I don't have to tell this crowd, this audience. So let me do a little bit of the analysis that helps us think about these questions. And we'll start out with the capabilities that certainly that the Russians have brought to the Ukrainian borders. As again, newspapers that Brad referred to, you got 100 to 120, some say 127, up to with the possibility of going to 170 some thousand Russian troops on 3 borders of Ukraine. So you got the north, you got the Russians moving into Belarus on the north. I was thinking, Brad, too late now, but I should have had a map on here. But people can probably have seen maps now in the papers for some time. So picture Ukraine. On its northern border is Belarus, and the Russians are moving their forces into Belarus, and they are threatening the shortest route to Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, is from Belarus. It's just due south. It goes through. You can picture this: the exclusion zone around Chernobyl is right on the Belarusian border. So that's on the northern border. We all know, we've heard over and over for the past 8 years about Ukraine's eastern border with Russia, where the Russians have invaded and sent their military forces in on several occasions. Probably a bunch of them are still there in what we call Donbass, eastern part of Ukraine, 2 eastern provinces, and part of those 2 provinces, Luhansk and Donetsk, are occupied by Russians and Russian-led forces. So that's on the eastern border. And on the south, again, the Russians invaded in 2014 and have illegally annexed Crimea. So if you're picturing the map in your head, that peninsula to the south of Ukraine, on the southern part of Ukraine, it is the southern part of Ukraine, is the Crimean Peninsula, and the Russians now occupy and illegally have annexed that part of Ukraine. So that's in the immediate vicinity. Again, the stories today in the press are that there are naval forces, Russian naval forces, that are moving toward the Black Sea for exercises, just like the ground forces are exercising. Nuclear forces are exercising. This is troubling. The bomber force is onward and is in place. Massed artillery, mentioned the armor already. So those military forces are clearly primed, are clearly in place. But they haven't stopped there. The Russians do this. The Russians have special forces agents in Ukraine um, um, for several reasons. One, of course, we talked about in the press last week. We've identified. We know that there are Russian special forces in Ukraine who are prepared and probably preparing to attack Russian and Russian-led forces in Donbass. So this is Russian special forces attacking Russian forces across the line. So the Russian forces, the special forces, are in Ukraine proper, the unoccupied territories, we call that, and they will under a false flag, Ukrainian flag, a false flag, they will attack Russian and Russian-led forces in the occupied territories in Donbass, thus trying to provoke a response or justify a response from the major forces. False flag operations. We've also heard just in the past from the Brits, and corroborated by American sources and American authorities, that the Russians have been essentially running agents in an attempt to set up or put in place a possible puppet regime. So a possible coup. Let's be clear about what we're talking about. The Russians have apparently been very close in touch with Ukrainian members of parliament, Ukrainian members of the Ukrainian parliament, the Rada, and others who are Ukrainians, former officials in the Yanukovych regime. President Yanukovych was the president of Ukraine. Everybody on this call will probably remember, who was run out of Kyiv, fled Kyiv in 2014, which then prompted the Russians to invade Crimea and Donbass. So the capabilities that the Russians have put in place, both and through their special agents and special forces and their overt military capabilities, are very clear. What do they intend? And I say they, but it's really, what does he intend? There's a decision maker there, President Putin, who's going to make the decision. I'm hoping that he has not yet made a decision, that it can still be deterred. And we'll talk about that before, but he's got a decision to make. And what's he thinking? Again, no one knows what's in his head. People have studied smarter than I am, and know more than I do, and have been watching President Putin for far longer than I have, who don't really know what's in his head. But what we do know are things that he's done and said. And so one of the things that he has done that makes us worry about his intentions is in the middle of December, middle of last month, he and his foreign ministry put down on the table, slapped down on the table, 2 draft treaties that had a range of demands. And one of the demands was sign these right away. And included in these treaties, one with Russia and the United States, one with Russia and NATO, but included in these treaties were clearly unacceptable demands. For example, they demanded that NATO remove all of its infrastructure, its military infrastructure, its defense infrastructure that have gone into place since 1997, since several of the newer members of NATO joined that organization. So roll back the military infrastructure is 1997. They have demanded in these draft treaties explicitly that NATO change its policy on membership. NATO, as everybody knows, has an open door policy. That open door policy has been the case for a long time. Indeed, since the beginning, since the Washington Treaty in 1949, it says in that treaty that any European country who meets the standards can apply. And it will take a unanimous agreement of the current members to accept new members. And this process, as we know, has taken place since the end of the Cold War. We know that we know all of the people, all of the nations who have joined NATO since. So it was 16 nations before before the wall fell, and now it's 30 nations. So this is this demand from the Russians that the door be closed, in particular on Ukraine and also on Georgia, is unacceptable. We can't do that. I mean, we can't even. It's not even possible for us to make that promise, even if we wanted to, which we don't. We'll be clear, but we can't. It's in the NATO Founding Act. It would take all the members. So to say unacceptable demands, they know, the Russians know that these are unacceptable demands, and so what does that say about their intent? People worry. I worry that they make demands that they know are unacceptable so that they can justify an invasion. So again, we're trying to figure out what the intent, what their intentions are. We know the capabilities, talk about intentions, and that's one indication. Another thing that, again, this one man who's going to make this decision, President Putin, has given us a hint, a strong hint, very strong hint. So he published a document last summer. Who knows if he wrote it? He signed it. 5,000 words of history of Russia and Ukraine. The punchline of which is Ukraine's not really a nation. Ukraine is not sovereign. Ukraine's really just part of Russia. Ukraine's never been a country. And we remember, so Brad mentioned I was in Ukraine 2006, 2009. In 2008, President Bush came through Kyiv on the way to Bucharest, where NATO was having its annual summit. And at that summit was on the table was the question of membership action plan for NATO, for Ukraine and Georgia to join NATO. President Bush was pushing very hard for an approval of that membership action plan. Didn't come. European allies said no. And as I said, it has to be unanimous to make these decisions. But also at that 2008 NATO summit was Vladimir Putin. And Vladimir Putin leaned over, famously now, I'm telling you, probably everybody on this call knows this story, but Vladimir Putin leans over to President Bush, says, George, you know that Ukraine's not really a country. President Bush did not know that Ukraine was not really a country. President Bush had just come from Kyiv, where he'd met with the president and the prime minister and the defense minister and a lot of Ukrainians, all of whom had told him that they, A, were a nation, B, wanted to join NATO. Now, let's be clear. Joining NATO in Ukraine at that time was not have more than 50%. It had much less than 50% support. But Ukraine was interested in applying. The government was interested in applying. And at that Bucharest summit, the answer was no. But in this long essay that President Putin wrote or signed in this past summer, he makes it explicit that Ukraine is not a country, is not a separate nation, doesn't have sovereignty, and the implication is Russia should absorb it. Russia should control it. He said that Ukraine cannot be sovereign outside of the Russian control. So again, trying to figure out what the intent is. What's his intention for assembling all of this capabilities, military capability on the three borders? So a couple of writers that most people on this call will have read. One you read every Wednesday in the New York Times. You read I read Tom Friedman, and he had an interesting way of describing Putin's attitude toward Ukraine, and Tom Friedman said, "Marry me, or I will kill you." This was This is the way he characterized it. Now, Tim Snyder is a historian at Yale, also very well informed, a great historian, written some great books. He quotes a German saying that goes in the same direction, and that is, "If you won't be my brother, I will smash your skull." Um, Now, this is serious. Um, this is serious. The Russians are, Mr. Putin is talking about invading a country, and that invasion will undoubtedly kill tens of thousands of Ukrainian military and civilians. It will undoubtedly result in the deaths of thousands of Russian military. These these implications are very serious, and the motivation, the intentions of President Putin is what we're trying to figure out. But this is very serious. What are President Putin's options? Two general approaches, two general options. One is attack, which we've been talking about. There is another option, and it's to negotiate. There are legitimate areas of negotiation that are included in those two draft treaties I mentioned a minute ago that the Russians slapped on the table, demanded agreement back in December. And some of those I've already mentioned, some of those demands are unacceptable, which leads us to believe he might actually be looking for a justification to attack. But there are some of those demands in those draft treaties that are worth discussing. That, if reciprocally applied, could make NATO better off, could make Russia better off. We'll come to those. But so there's two options: attack and negotiate. Attack options, and the press is full of these of analyses of what he might do. Again, no one knows, but there are concerns, and they have different implications. There is the massive air bombardment with missiles, short-range ballistic missiles, intermediate-range ballistic missiles, long-range artillery, in an attempt to get Ukraine to surrender. There's the full-on ground invasion, when they full-on attack, where he sends the armored formations, backed by artillery, backed by infantry, into Ukraine, probably preceded by that large air attack bombardment. There are a series of smaller kind of grab and pause scenarios that we talked about. He could take Kharkiv, a city just to the north of Donbass. He could take Mariupol, a city just to the south of Donbass, on the way across the Sea of Azov, the coast of the Sea of Azov, toward, including Mariupol, and toward Odessa. There's that southern attack. There's a now famous water canal from Kherson, from Ukraine into Crimea. That's been blocked ever since the Russians invaded and occupy Crimea. So one of the options is for Putin to try to take back that water canal. Cyber attacks. We've already talked about possible coups. Energy cutoff. The Russians have already attacked. They've already conducted cyber attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure, energy infrastructure. In 2015, they cut off and blackened the western part of Ukraine in a cyber attack, just to show the Ukrainians that they could do this, and so they could do this again on a broader scale. There are a lot of options that President Putin has. The alternative, as I mentioned, he could negotiate. Just a couple of specifics on the negotiation side that are open to him if he's interested in this. he's complained about the possibility of NATO, United States, stationing missiles in Ukraine that would be 7 minutes from Moscow. United States has concern, NATO has concern about Russian placement of missiles in European Russia that would threaten Western capitals. Obviously, the United States has no intention of putting strategic weapons or non-strategic weapons like this into Ukraine, but for that reason and other reasons, we'd be happy to have that conversation. There have been discussions about reviving or revisiting or refreshing the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, the INF treaty, for some time. This is not the first time. But if that was in this draft treaty, one of the draft treaties that the Russians slapped down on the table back in December, we can have that conversation. We can sit around that table. And fact is, as you all know, there have been the strategic stability dialogues at the government level going on since last summer, since President Putin, President Biden agreed in Geneva to start those again. And so there have been now 3 of those meetings, and one of the topics in those strategic stability dialogues, SSD dialogues, is INF, intermediate range nuclear forces. So that's an issue. Let's have that conversation. That'll be fine. Everybody on this call remembers we also had some constraints on conventional forces. There was a conventional forces in Europe, CFE treaty, no longer in effect. INF's no longer in effect. CFE is no longer in effect. INF because of Russian violation. CFE, same kind of reason. The Russians maintain troops in Moldova and in Georgia. So CFE even amended, updated to recognize the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact is not in effect. But that's worthy of discussion. Some constraints on military exercises. Russians have complained about nuclear armed or potentially nuclear armed aircraft coming close to their borders in exercises. We could have that conversation. We've got concerns, obviously, about their exercises. They say all these 127,000 troops on Ukraine's borders are an exercise. Okay, let's have some visibility, some advance notice, some risk reduction, some transparency, exchange observers in these exercises, so we can have some confidence that you're not really planning to invade. You know, we can have that conversation. We can refresh INF, we can refresh CFE. There are these kind of conversations that can definitely be had. There's a broader set of issues that we ought to consider as well, and this could take place with all European nations at OSCE, and there have been discussions there having to do with a recommitment to the principles that more or less kept the peace after World War II up until 2014, when the Russians violated all these principles with their invasion of Ukraine. So these principles are embedded in the UN Charter, in the Helsinki principles, Paris Charter, the Russia-NATO Council Charter. These have been stated, restated, committed to, and recommitted to over and over, and they have to do with principles like sovereignty. They acknowledge, they recognize, they're committed to sovereignty for all nations in Europe, including Ukraine. So all this talk about Ukraine not being sovereign, Ukraine not being a real country, violates that principle. But we could, if we were to recommit to, if we get the Russians to recommit, and if there's a recommitment to these principles that kept the peace, not totally, but it certainly avoided any major land wars in Europe for 69 years. A recommitment to those kind of things, that's worth having conversations about. One last set of discussions are taking place and should be recognized, and that is the negotiations between the Russians and Ukrainians over Donbass, the original problem here, where the Russians invaded Crimea and invaded Donbass. And since 2014, 2015, the so-called Minsk process under the Normandy Four, the Russians, Ukrainians, Germans, and French have been trying unsuccessfully to resolve that, to address that, and solve that conflict. The United States has recently agreed and has begun to engage in those processes. We're not talking about a Normandy 5. We're not talking about adding the United States to that Normandy format. The French and the Germans and the Russians and Ukrainians will continue to have those discussions. But the United States has now re-entered, we did this before, we've now re-entered those negotiations to encourage or supplement, complement the negotiations that are going on in the Normandy format that are trying to solve the Donbass issue. Crimea will come later, just to be clear. Let me just, we'll address that one. Those are his options, attack or negotiate. As he's thinking about these options, and again, we're talking about Mr. Putin, the considerations that I think he should be keeping in mind. I'm hoping that the people around him are raising these questions, considerations, consequences of an invasion, because I hope he can be deterred. And again, deterrence is what we are now engaged in. We're trying to deter this war, this major land war. I've already talked about the massive casualties on both sides. This has to be a consideration. What another attack, another invasion would do would be to consolidate for generations a hostile nation on Russia's border. I mentioned that I was in Ukraine from 2006, 2009. And I went back in 2019. In the middle, there was an invasion. The Russians invaded Ukraine. So when I was there the first time, before the invasion, before there was any thought of an invasion by the Russians, there were conversations, there were real politics in Ukraine about a Western orientation, Eastern orientation. There were debates and arguments about language. There were debates and arguments about NATO. That's real politics. It was reflected in the elections, in the Ukrainian elections, the presidential elections, where what the pattern you saw was the Ukrainian people in these elections all would elect a president from the East. In the next election, they would elect a president from the West. And the next one, the East again, and then the West again. The point is, it was real politics up until 2014. And there was a debate between people that were more oriented toward Russia and people who were more oriented toward Europe. That ended in 2014. So when I went back in 2019, the politics were very different. And they were very anti-Russian. They were very anti-Russian. And if he were to invade again, that would just consolidate the hostility, the hatred as the enemy that would characterize Ukrainian feelings toward Russia for generations. So that's a consideration. That's not what he wants. He wants to marry them. He wants to be their brother. That's not what he wants. So an invasion would mean that they would hate him for generations. If he were to be so foolish, as in my view, as to invade, the international community, I am absolutely convinced, would condemn him overwhelmingly. We know the diplomacy that has gone on, this flurry of diplomacy, these phone calls, these meetings, among groups of G7 and NATO, the G9 or the B9, the East European, the Allied, Japanese Secretary of State and Deputy Secretary of State have been on the phone with the Kuwaitis, with the Saudis, with the Indians. This has been a major effort to build support for Ukraine against Russia, and that support that's already showing up. I mean, it shows up in a commitment to put on sanctions, which we'll talk about in a second. But also, it's a commitment to condemn the Russian invasion if it occurs. And I am absolutely sure that that will happen. Russia will be a pariah state. It will be isolated. I don't know what the Chinese will do. Who knows what the Chinese will do? We do remember in 2014 when Putin invaded Ukraine, first in Crimea, then in Donbass, and we took them to the United Nations Security Council, put in a resolution. Of course, the Russians vetoed that. Nonetheless, it was very clear. The Chinese, very interesting, the Chinese abstained. Chinese abstained. They didn't support the Russian annexation. And when we took it, just to finish that story, we then took it to the General Assembly, UN General Assembly. There was an overwhelming vote, 100 to 10. And you know which 10 supported the Russians, the North Koreans and the Cubans, probably the Venezuelans. It was overwhelming condemnation of Russia in the UN. That will happen again. He'll be isolated. I mentioned sanctions. I suspect that what I say about sanctions, someone in this crowd, I'm hoping, will challenge this because this is not without controversy. But the sanctions that are being prepared, and I'm convinced are prepared to be imposed on the Russians, should they decide to send forces across the border, or I would even say to shoot across the border. So if they were to attack Ukraine with ground forces or air bombardment, the sanctions that would go into effect are, as the administration has said, and others, the EU has said, and the European allies have said, much harsher than anything the Russians have seen. And President Biden has outlined, has specified to President Putin in the phone call in December what these sanctions will do. They've not been explicit, but we have a sense of the kind of sanctions that we're talking about, and they are harsh and they are damaging. We're talking about sanctioning and basically putting out of business the 3 or 5 largest banks in Ukraine, in Russia, sorry, in Russia. These banks, these Russian banks, account for probably 96% of the transactions that take place in Russia. Sanctioning these banks would be as effective, maybe more effective, than what we had been talking about as the nuclear sanction. I use that word carefully in this crowd, of SWIFT, the SWIFT information system is, as everybody here knows, we've learned all these acronyms. We know about SWIFT. It's the way that that financial transactions are transmitted around the world. And again, careful about this word, but the nuclear option on sanctions has been SWIFT. But as effective, maybe even more effective, is sanctioning these top 3 to 5 Russian banks. It will have the same effect, combined with, and that would be immediately, that would be quick, combined with a longer term acting sanction on cutting the Russian economy off from exports of high-tech components, microchips, that go into, yes, they go into cell phones, but they also go into weapons. This would be, if they were to be cut off, and we know how to do this. We've done this with Huawei, and the Chinese company, and it was very effective against Huawei. So this was, so we know how to do this. This can be done. This is a credible threat to the Russian econothe. These sanctions, again, people are going to challenge this, but I'm going to give you something to challenge. We put on sanctions when the Russians invaded Ukraine in 2014, and when they invaded Crimea, and then Donbass. And we put sanctions on individuals who are responsible for those decisions, and we put sanctions on sectors of the Russian economy. We know they hurt. We know they are painful for the Russians because the Russians complain about it all the time. They want these sanctions that have been in place since 2014 removed. We also know that these threatened sanctions that President Biden outlined to President Putin in December in that phone call, we know that they're very worried about those because President Putin famously said to President Biden, if you impose those sanctions on us, it will disrupt relations. It will destroy relations between our two countries for generations. He knows what's coming. He knows that this would damage his already fragile economy. The only thing they've got, of course, is hydrocarbons. Hydrocarbon prices are high now. They won't be for long, for over the longer term. This may be the high point of Russia's reliance on. This may be the high point of the one thing that Russia relies on, which is hydrocarbon exports. So it's a fragile economy. These sanctions have already hurt that economy. The sanctions promised now with the Europeans would be catastrophic for the Russian economy. And President Putin knows this. Investors will flee. They've already started. The ruble is already sinking in response to this. NATO weapons will flow into Ukraine. They already started. We've seen even the Baltic nations sending Stingers and javelins, these anti-aircraft and anti-tank weapons coming from the Baltic states. Yes, we provided these, but we've also given permission to the Baltic states to send them on to Ukraine. The U.S. flow of weapons, the flow of U.S. weapons has already increased dramatically, and it would increase further if the Russians were to come across that border. In addition, U.S. forces will be deployed to the eastern NATO allies. We saw just yesterday the alert given to 8,500 U.S. soldiers to be ready to go in 5 days to deploy to the eastern flank of NATO in response to the threat. They're talking about deploying these even before the Russians come across the border. This is active deterrence. Active deterrence is where you put things in effect, you do things in advance of an invasion. It is deterrence. It is designed, that action and these others that we're talking about are designed to deter an attack. That's the goal. That is the goal. Russians have been talking about, Mr. Putin's been really proud that he's about to open a gas pipeline from Russia into Germany called Nord Stream 2. Many people here are very familiar with this. It's not in operation yet. The United States should have put sanctions on the Russians and all the companies who are building that, who have built that pipeline. We didn't. We waived those sanctions. It was a mistake in my view. But that pipeline, Putin was really anticipating it's going into operation. It's becoming operational because it would give that much more leverage over Europe. Europe is already very dependent on Russian gas. A lot of that gas now comes across Ukraine. It comes in pipelines that come across Ukraine. And what Putin has done is built this pipeline to avoid those pipelines, to go around those pipelines across Ukraine and just go straight into Germany under the sea, so that he doesn't have to be vulnerable doesn't have to pay the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians can't interfere in that. So this is clearly a political move to build this pipeline, but it's not yet in operation. And the Germans wisely, finally, have said, "Oh, I think there's some more regulatory requirements that the Nord Stream 2 pipeline has to meet," which they haven't met. So it's not in operation yet. And if Putin were to decide to invade Ukraine, we've been led to believe, and I do believe, that the Germans would not put that pipeline into operation. So that's another consequence of that invasion. I will argue, and again, some people on this call will challenge me on this. I will argue that that a Russian invasion of Ukraine would not be popular in Russia. That the Russian people are not particularly ill-disposed to Ukraine. In fact, they do see the Ukrainians as their brothers. And this is very interesting. The Russian media, obviously an arm of the Russian government, of the Kremlin, in 2014, before that invasion, was hysterical, was hysterically anti-Ukrainian. And the media back in 2014, the Russian media back in 2014 portrayed Ukrainians as fascists, neo-Nazis. Turns out, of course, that that Ukraine was only the second country in the world to have a Jewish president and a Jewish prime minister at the same time. But nonetheless, back in 2014, there was this this rabid media attack on Ukraine as oppressing Russians and not allowing Russian to be spoken and oppressing Russian speakers, and that these neo-Nazis in Kyiv had to be neutralized somehow, and thus the rationale and the justification for the invasion in 2014 was built on this media story. That's not the case today. It's so interesting. Today, the Russian media is not focused on Ukraine. If anything, it's focused on NATO, on the United States, on the influence that the United States has on Ukraine, the possibility of NATO attacking Russia. This is where the media, the Russian media, is today, and that suggests to me that the Kremlin recognizes that an invasion of Ukraine, a brotherly country, would not be popular, and it would be very unpopular if Russian soldiers come back dead from that invasion. Very unpopular. So there have been Russian soldiers killed in Donbass, and that's been totally suppressed in the Russian media. Any Russian journalist who publicizes or mentions that there were Russian soldiers killed in Donbass either disappears or is sanctioned, is hushed. The mothers of dead soldiers have been quieted. The Russian leadership, the Kremlin's very concerned about Russian casualties. And that suggests to me that the media focus on NATO, on the United States, on challenges from there, and not on the Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian country, the Ukrainian side, it's not there. That suggests to me that they know that this would not be a popular invasion. Somebody's going to challenge me on that. I'm confident. I'd be disappointed if you don't. Last thing on the consequences. Now, some people have tried to get in Putin's head, and again, smarter people than I have written histories about him, biographies about him. People tell me he wants to go down in history, Russian history, with the greats, with Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. If he invades and kills a lot of Ukrainians, but kills a lot of Russians, he's going to go down in history, I think, as did the dictators of last century. Let's just say it. Hitler invaded, he lost. He is not well regarded in history. Putin will be will not be well regarded. History will not be friendly to a Russian invasion of Ukraine. Again, we can talk about that. Okay, those are the consequences. Couple of last points here, Brad, and I appreciate the opportunity to kind of walk through this. Why does Ukraine matter to the United States? Why should people in California care about what's going on in Ukraine? Why does it? What are the strategic interests? What are the interests, the national interests that we have that make us care about that country? I would say two things. One is more of a moral issue, and the other is more analytic. The moral issue is Ukraine is on the front line. Ukraine is on the front line of the war that Russia is fighting against Ukraine, but it's fighting against the West. It is fighting Ukraine now. Ukraine is on that front line. The Russians first attacked Ukraine and then they attacked others. Think of election meddling. I was in Ukraine in 2014 when after the pro-Russian Ukrainian president fled, they had a presidential election that ended up electing President Petro Poroshenko, pro-West. And the Russians meddled in that election. The Russians were in the Central Election Commission computers. And the Central Election Commission was very worried on election day. I was there that the Russians might be able to affect the outcome. In the end, they didn't. They weren't able to, and the Election Commission was able to block that. But they tried. 2014. We know, been well documented, that the Russians tried to and did intervene in our elections in 2016. We won't say if they were successful or not, but we know what they did and who they were and what their goal was in 2016. The Russians start in Ukraine, which is on the front line, and the Russians go further. They cyber attack, same thing. I mentioned already that the Russians used a cyber attack on the electricity grid in the western part of Ukraine in 2015. We know that they did something similar, solar winds. We know they did something similar on pipelines, energy pipelines on the East Coast, not on the West Coast, but here on the East Coast, that had a real effect. The Russians start in Ukraine and then they go farther. Ukraine's on the front line. I will argue that the United States, other countries as well, we support our military when they are fighting on our behalf, and we support them. And for that same reason, I argue that the United States and the international community, in particular the West, the European nations, ought to support Ukraine because it's on the front line fighting for them. There are no American soldiers, there are no European soldiers in Ukraine that are fighting. These are Ukrainian soldiers who are on the front line, and we should support them. That's the moral argument. The analytic argument I've already referred to obliquely, but let me just state it finally, which is the Russian attack on Ukraine back in 2014 and another attack in 2022 would be to destroy the order that kept the peace in general terms by and large in Europe for 69 years from World War II until they invaded in 2014. This network of treaties, of principles, of goals, of obligations in the UN Charter, in Paris, in Budapest. The Budapest Memorandum, I don't think I even mentioned it earlier, but in the Budapest Memorandum, the Russians and the Americans and the Brits assured Ukraine of its security and of its territorial integrity and of its sovereignty if they gave up the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world, which they did. Ukrainians in the mid-90s gave up the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world in return for an assurance from the Russians and the Americans and the Brits and others would sign on later that their territorial integrity, their sovereignty would be protected. So this attack, this invasion, would destroy that, would destroy the whole network of a liberal international order that is kept peace. That's an important piece for us. And restoring that would be a long way towards restoring the possibility of peace in Europe. Quick on policy implications for me, I hope that that the Ukrainians and the Americans and the Europeans will hold firm, will not cave, will not try to accommodate, will not try to appease Putin on his demands and his saber rattling and his massing of forces. Keep nerve, stare him down, don't blink. Active deterrence, move forces in that direction, recognize and highlight the sanctions that are going to go on if he invades. So active deterrence, holding firm, those are the policy implications that I see for us right now. And Brad, I've gone on too long. I want to, I'm really looking forward to the questions on this thing, but we can talk about, you know, the answer to Dave Petraeus' question. General Petraeus asked it famously in Iraq, how does this end? We should talk about that. I'd love to have people's thoughts on this, but let me stop there. And Brad, open to comments and challenges. I hope that people will have something to argue about.
Bill, that was great. Thank you.